So last week we essentially talked about the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Today we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is a subset of those two. It is not its own separate thing. You're going to see this is parts of the central nervous system working with parts of the peripheral nervous system for a specific purpose. So it's called the autonomic nervous system because it runs itself. It's involuntary. We can't control this. These are going to be things that our body recognizes something is going on around us, and it's going to change and determine how our body is going to react with it. And the things that it's going to change are things that are very, very important to our life. It's not going to be a muscle reflex. It's not going to be when I touch something hot that makes me pull it back. It's going to change things about our body that are very, very important to our life. This is similar to the fight or flight mechanism. Okay? We're going to see that the autonomic nervous system has two parts. One of them is fight or flight. And so one half of this is going to be that fight or flight mechanism. The other part is going to be something that's going to want us to maintain continuity. So one part is going to try to maintain homeostasis, and the other one is going to prepare our body for danger. It's a kind of interesting experiment. The guy that found this found that if you remove the autonomic nervous system from an animal, the animal does not immediately die, but it can't fend for itself. You have to care for that animal, you have to keep it warm, and you have to eliminate all of its stress. Now, before we talk about what the autonomic nervous system is, how do you think you would remove the autonomic nervous system from an animal? Just kind of get you thinking in terms of experiments. Would you paralyze it?
Lobotomy?
Yeah. You take out parts of the brain. And just go into probably, I don't know if I'm going to say, probably a mouse or a rat, and you would physically remove part of the brain that's responsible for the autonomic nervous system and leave in the rest that's needed for everything else. So autonomic nervous system is a motor nervous system. So it's going to be sending signals out to parts of our body, and it's going to control glands, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle is not here. So it's going to induce glands in our body to secrete things. It's going to control cardiac muscle. So it's going to control how fast our heart is beating. And it's also going to control smooth muscle, which the blood vessels in our body are made up of smooth muscle. So it's going to control how big our blood vessels are. And by doing that, it's going to help determine our blood pressure. Two of the main things that control our blood pressure is how fast your heart is beating and how big your blood vessels are. So this is going to work primarily in our internal organs. And so this is going to be on the thoracic and abdominal cavities, primarily, big organs. But it's going to be part of things on the outside of our body. So cutaneous blood vessels. So what do we mean by cutaneous blood vessels? Skin. Blood vessels in our skin, our sweat glands, and the piloerector muscles. So think about what happens when you get stressed or scared.
Sweat.
You can sweat from stress. You get goosebumps, right? You can't control that. I mean, you can't say, yes, I'm scared, but I don't want my hair to stand up on end and get goosebumps. That's your autonomic nervous system doing it. Remember, this is involuntary. You cannot control these things. And for most of these functions of the autonomic nervous system, they are not the sole control of those organs. So things like our heart it's going to function without the autonomic nervous system. So like if we took the ANS out of that rat, the rat's heart didn't stop beating. It just was very hard for the rat to control the heartbeat of that rat. It's also going to prevent that rat from responding to outside stimuli. So normally if you stress an animal, its heart rate is going to go up. That rat though, it wouldn't. But evolutionarily, there is a reason why when we get stressed, our heart beats faster. It allows us to respond to a danger outside. If you remove the autonomic nervous system, and then you stress that rat, it's not going to be able to respond. If it's in a cage, it doesn't have that danger, right? We know it's going to survive regardless. But if it's out in the wild and something's trying to eat it, and it can't respond, it's going to get eaten. If you remove that, sometimes yes, you lose control of being able to really turn something on like that, but you lose the ability to keep it constant. And so you may see wild swings. You may see it beating very, very fast. You may see it beating very, very slowly. If you cut that out, you get what is called denervation hypersensitivity. So denervation is the removal of the nerves. So you're removing it or cutting them. You're preventing that nerve signal from getting to the organ. And hypersensitivity is just saying that things are going to go crazy. So like I said, there are two parts of the autonomic nervous system, and a lot of times they're both going to be connected to the same organ. An organ that's controlled by the autonomic nervous system will usually be controlled by both halves. One is going to try to keep it constant, the other one's going to try to ramp it up. And so there's going to be a constant battle to see which one wins. In most cases, they're going to have contrasting effects. So like I said, one's going to try to keep it low, one's going to try to turn it up. But in some cases, they'll actually be cooperative. And so this is going to allow some parts of our body to crank it way up. So if something bad happens, both divisions are going to make the organ do the same thing. The first is the sympathetic division. This is the one that prepares our body for danger. This is the fight or flight mechanism. It's going to allow us to run faster. If you increase blood pressure, you increase the amount of blood getting to your muscle. It's going to allow us to go faster. We can also increase anger. I mean, in a dangerous situation, anger or a fearful response can sometimes influence the decisions that we make. And evolutionarily, that may make us more likely to survive a dangerous experience. It's going to do this by increasing our heart rate. So that's two things. It's going to pump the blood faster. It's also going to increase our blood pressure. It's going to increase the blood pressure primarily by not only making your heart beat faster, but by decreasing the blood vessel size. It's going to make us breathe faster. It's going to increase blood glucose levels. Where do you think that glucose is going to come from? I mean, it's not going to make us eat.
Your stores.
Stores. Where is the glucose stored?
Muscles.
Some of it's in
Fat.
muscles, yes.
Adipose tissue.
So adipose tissue is kind of a long-term storage.
Ah.
That takes a while to get it out.
Ah, gotcha.
What's the kind of short-term synthesis? It's a kind of a big long chain of glucose. Glycogen, yeah. Where is most of the glycogen in our body stored? Pancreas causes it to be stored and causes it to be taken out. Somebody just said it. Start with an L. Liver.
Okay.
Most of the glycogen in our body is stored in our liver. So it's going to cause some of the glucose to be made from the glycogen in our liver. It's also going to reduce blood flow to our skin and digestive tract. There are two reasons why we want that to happen. Why do we want to reduce blood flow to the skin and digestive tract?
Conservation of power.
I think I know what you're, well, can you explain it a little bit more?
Like your stomach's constantly working like all the time without you really knowing. So in the fight or flight response where it's really not needed, that energy could go elsewhere.
Yes. So that is one of the two big reasons. We want that blood somewhere that's going to help us survive. But having that blood in our stomach and our intestines is not going to help us survive at that instant. Why else would we not want it in our skin? So taking it out of our skin is going to serve that same purpose, but why else?
If you get your arm cut off or something horrible
Yeah.
and horribly injured, less blood comes out.
Correct. If you have less blood in your skin and you get cut, you're going to lose less blood. The other half is the parasympathetic division. So the term para normally means opposite. So we have the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. This is the one that tries to calm everything down. Okay? You've got the devil on your shoulder and the angel on the other. This one is telling you to calm down. This is going to primarily inactivate all of these things and also increase digestion and waste elimination. The things that we have to do to survive long term, but don't need to do short term. So where this is flight or fight, this is resting and digesting. Okay? So like I said, for the most part, it's going to be a balance. At one point in time, which one is winning? So what exists in a normal situation, a non-stressful atmosphere, is called the autonomic tone. It is the background rate. We normally have this much signal going to our heart. This is how fast our heart normally beats. This is how much we normally digest. So the parasympathetic tone is going to determine the normal amounts for things that are primarily controlled by the parasympathetic division. So it's going to determine smooth muscle tone in our intestines. So our intestines contract to move things, right? That's smooth muscle doing that. So the parasympathetic tone is the normal amount of that movement. It's also going to try to keep our heart rate at about 70 to 80 beats per minute. It's trying to anchor our heart rate at 70 to 80 beats per minute. The sympathetic tone is the background that's going to keep our blood vessels kind of constricted. It's going to make sure that we have a decent amount of blood pressure at all times. But the majority of what the sympathetic division does is not here included in the sympathetic tone, because most of that's going to be a response mechanism. We don't want those things to happen unless we need them to happen, whereas this is more of a returning back to normal system. So the sympathetic division is going to turn up the heart, but inhibit digestive and urinary systems. And the parasympathetic system is going to do the opposite. Parasympathetic is going to turn up the maintenance systems and turn down the stress reactions. So the autonomic nervous system, like I said, is part of the central nervous system and part of the peripheral nervous system. So the main control is going to come from the hypothalamus and parts of the brainstem. And then there are going to be signals coming from those locations. They're going to travel down motor neurons in the spinal cord and go through the peripheral ganglia. And some of the systems up in our head, the nerve fibers are going to go through the cranial and spinal nerves. And so if we're controlling blood vessels in our head, those motor neurons are not going to come from our brain down into our spinal cord and back up. And so in those cases, they would go straight through a cranial nerve. If we're going down things like our heart, it's going to come down our spinal cord and then out a spinal nerve. So the way that things are going to move through this system is a little bit different than it is what we learned last week in the central and peripheral nervous system. And so in the somatic nervous system, think about the peripheral nervous, things like going to our muscles and things. And so in that pathway, we had a motor neuron that started in our brainstem, and then it had one long axon that's going to come out, it's covered in myelin, and it's going to go all the way down to the skeletal muscle that it controls. So essentially we have one gigantic axon that's going to go the whole way. But in the autonomic nervous system, there's going to be at least two neurons, okay? There's going to be one that comes out of the brain, and then there's going to be another one that it connects to that carries that signal onto its effector. So where those two meet, we're going to have a synapse. And then so because we have a synapse, we're going to have a presynaptic neuron. That's the one that starts in our brain, or starts in our spinal cord. And then there will be a post-ganglionic neuron, which is going to be after the synapse. The synapse is going to be in a ganglion. Remember, which is kind of a group of nerves. It's kind of like an intersection, a bundle of nerves. So the presynaptic neuron is going to come into one of these ganglia and then pass that signal on to the post-ganglionic neuron, and then that will take it to the effector. So this is what we're just talking about. So this is the somatic pathway. So we have a neuron, so this is the cell body of the neuron in the gray matter here, and then the axon actually comes all the way from that all the way out to the skeletal muscle. But here we have two neurons. There's the one that's in the gray matter, but it's going to come out, reach a ganglion, and then synapse to a second one. And that second one is not going to be myelinated. And that second one will carry the signal on to whatever it's going to control. In this case, it's the heart. So the first the first neuron is going to be part of the central nervous system, because it's going to be coming out of the brain or the spinal cord. The second one will be part of the peripheral nervous system, because if it's not part of the brain or spinal cord, it's not part of the central nervous system. So the sympathetic, we're going to come back to that. Another term you can see as a name for that is the thoracolumbar division, because it comes from the thoracic and the lumbar parts of our spinal cord. You're probably not going to see that very often. Sympathetic division is the term you're going to see most often. And in the sympathetic division, we have those two neurons. In the sympathetic division, the preganglionic neuron, the first one, is going to be short, and then the postganglionic fiber is going to be long. And so the ganglion is going to be very near to the brain or the spinal cord. You're going to have like a little cord coming out of the brain, and then you plug it into a big long extension cord to take it to wherever it needs to go. What we're going to see is that in the parasympathetic division, it's opposite. You run a big long cord that almost makes it to the heart, but then you need just a little short little extension cord to take it the rest of the way. So the preganglionic neurons are in the lateral horn, in the area in the gray matter of the spinal cord. So these are going to come from spinal nerves T1 to L2. Do you remember what the T and the L stand for? Thoracic and lumbar. And what do the numbers mean? Just which one. And so T1 is the first thoracic spinal nerve. Lumbar is the second, L2 is the second lumbar spinal nerve. So the nerve fiber is going to come out of the spinal nerve, and then it's going to go to the sympathetic chain of ganglia. So there's going to be a whole bunch of these ganglia. There's a very nice picture coming up, lined up along the spinal cord. So you have these tiny little shoots coming off the spinal cord, coming out to these big bundles of nerves running up and down along the spinal cord, and then you'll have the big long nerves coming out of that. So, so if you look at these ganglia that run up and down, there's some in the cervical region, a whole bunch in the thoracic region, some in the lumbar, sacral, and the coccygeal regions, and the nerve fibers that come out of them go to every region of our body. So this is what I was talking about. So we've got the brain, and then the spinal cord. And so we see short neurons coming out of the spinal cord, and then coming in and attaching to all of these ganglion that are running up and down on either side of our spinal cord. And then we have all of these very long neurons that are going to attach to the different organs in our body that the sympathetic division is going to control. So if we zoom in, it's actually, so a few slides later, we see this. And so if we look at the connection between the ganglia and the spinal nerve. So this is their spinal cord, the spinal nerve coming off, and the spinal nerve just continues on that way. But there's this little offshoot that comes over to the ganglion that we're dealing with. And if we look, there's actually two connections there. It's not just one. It's like an on-ramp and an off-ramp. And so those two branches, those two ramps, are called the rami, and they're communicating rami. Signals are going to go one way through one way through the other. And so the fibers that are going to leave the ganglion, that are going to go through what's called the gray communicating ramus. So there's going to be two. There's the white ramus and the gray ramus. And so postganglionic fibers are going to leave the ganglion, go through that gray ramus, and go back to the spinal cord. If you go back, the signals coming from the spinal nerve to the ganglion or go through the white ramus. And so you come from the spinal cord through the white communicating ramus into the ganglion, and then if you need to go back to the spinal cord, you'll go back through the gray. And then some of the postganglionic fibers will go from the ganglion straight to the organ that they're going to control, and some of them will actually go from the ganglion back into the spinal nerve, and then continue back down wherever the spinal nerve was going. We'll see that coming. And so, the postganglionic fiber, like we said, so these are the ones that are going to leave the ganglion. The signal has come from the central nervous system, it's gone into the ganglion, and now that signal has to go through the postganglionic neuron to wherever it is going. And there are a few different places that it can go. If you have one, I thought I saw something that I was not actually reading. So some of them will go into this should be pre. This word should be pre-ganglion. So we have neurons that are coming out of the central nervous system. They're going to go into the ganglion, and then they're going to do a few different things. So the first thing they can do is synapse with a postganglionic neuron. And so the way they have it written here, you can't have a postganglionic neuron synapsing with a postganglionic neuron. The pre synapses with the post. So that's the simplest situation. That's what we were talking about previously. Presynaptic goes into the ganglion, synapses with the post-ganglionic, and then it comes out. Some of them will actually go into the ganglion and then continue elsewhere to go to a different ganglion in order to synapse there. So we see that here. So think about these ganglion up here. We had a presynaptic neuron that came from the spinal cord, went into this ganglion, but it didn't create a synapse there. It continued up here, and then it's going to synapse with the postsynaptic neurons up here. So it went in, made a left-hand turn, and went up to a different ganglion. So at the very ends of the spinal cord, so we just saw the cervical end at the very top, it's also going to be the same at the bottom. So down here, they have to come out into this ganglion, make a right-hand turn, and come down. There are no presynaptic neurons that connect directly to these ganglia down here and up here. So a splanchnic nerve is one of these nerves that continues without forming a synapse. If you have a big, long presynaptic neuron that's going to continue through one ganglion into another, that's going to be called a splanchnic nerve. So here we have the cell bodies of our presynaptic or preganglionic neurons. They're going to come through here and then come into here. And then some of them are going to do different things. This one came in here and just kept on going up. All right? Turned, made a right-hand turn, came up, formed a synapse here, and then some of it also kept on going up. This one came in here and synapsed there. And then this one actually came in and then went to a ganglion that's not part of the chain. So we'll see an example of each of those different pathways. So the presynaptic neuron is going to come into the sympathetic chain, which is that chain of ganglia running up and down the spinal cord. And there are three ways it can leave: the spinal, sympathetic, and splanchnic nerve route. So the first one is the spinal nerve route. Okay? And so these are going to come into the ganglion, and then it's going to go back into the spinal nerve through the gray rings. It's going to go back into the spinal nerve, and it's going to follow it to wherever that spinal nerve is going. It's like getting off I-75, the gas back up, get back on I-75, and just keep on going whichever way it's going. And so there are some examples of things that are controlled by this route. We go back to here. This is the one that's going to come into here, turn around, form a synapse, and go right back into the spinal nerve and continue on out. So that is this one. The next one is the sympathetic nerve route. And so it is going to leave the ganglion, and it's going to make its way to organs like the heart and lungs, and come back. So, heart and lungs. So these are going to come in, they're going to make the turn, come on up, and move up to another ganglion in the chain. It's not going to leave the chain. It's going to come into the first ganglion that it hits and continue up or down the chain into a different ganglion. These are the ones that are going to go up into the cervical region or down into the very bottom of our body. These are going to be things like our heart and lungs, but they're also going to have some effects in our head, like the salivary glands and sweat, and also controlling our iris. So what happens if you get stressed, you've seen pictures of people, what happens to their eyes when they get really stressed?
Dilate.
They dilate. Your eyes get huge. I know you can really see it in a cat. Anybody have a cat? You just kind of make a quick movement and their eyes just go boom. They get giant and wide. That's the sympathetic nervous system dilating their iris. The last is a splanchnic nerve. So these are going to go through the chain and leave the chain and go to a different ganglia that is not part of the chain. So that's this one. It's going to come in here and just keep on going. It's going to leave our chain and come to a specialized ganglia. And once it's there, then it will synapse with the postganglionic fiber. So those ganglia that are not part of the chain are called collateral ganglia because they're kind of extra ganglia. They're not part of the primary system, they're their own. And so we're going to have a whole bunch of those, and that group of collateral ganglia are going to be called the abdominal aortic plexus. And they're going to control a lot of the blood vessels down in our abdomen. We have a lot of very important organs in our abdomen. We need to control how much blood is getting to them. So the three major collateral ganglia are the celiac, superior mesenteric, and inferior mesenteric. And like I said, their primary role is going to be to control the amount of blood that gets to our organs down in our abdomen. So the postganglionic fibers, the ones that are coming out of the ganglion, are going to more or less just follow an artery to an organ. The artery is going to, we know the artery is going there, and so the nerve is just going to follow it along the way. So the solar plexus is the name for the celiac and the superior mesenteric ganglia together. Has anyone ever heard of the solar plexus?
It's what you aim for if you want to knock the wind out of somebody.
Exactly, yes. So one of the other purposes of these ganglia, other than blood control, is also kind of control of the diaphragm. So if you ever have the wind knocked out of you, what happens is it causes this to stop working, and your diaphragm just starts spasming. In order to breathe, the diaphragm has to come way down and then way back up in a very controlled manner. If it's just sitting there fluttering, you're not breathing, okay? This is not, I mean, it seems like you see football players and people who get their wind knocked out of them and you say, oh, come on, it can't be that bad. It is.
It's awful.
It's god awful.
It feels like you are going to die. It's that bad. Okay? And it's called the solar plexus because it comes into the ganglia, and then you have all these nerves that come out, and it looks like the sun. So that's just why it's called the solar plexus. Remember, plexus is kind of the intersection with the ganglia, and then it's solar because we have all these radiating nerves coming up. So this is showing some of these ganglia. So here, this is the superior mesenteric, the celiac is up here. What was the other one? Inferior. So the inferior mesenteric is here. So you can see that this is just on these gigantic aortas, controlling a whole bunch of blood flow. So this is going to control more or less the constriction of the blood vessels along with some other functions. You can see one of these is going to come into the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands sit on top of the kidney. We're going to talk about those a little more coming up. So in the sympathetic division, there's what we call neuronal divergence. So if we come back, you start to follow one of these nerves that comes out of a ganglia, it just branches and branches and branches and branches. And so one nerve coming out of a ganglia is going to attach to a whole bunch of things. And each nerve can only carry one signal. And so one signal is going to affect a whole bunch of things. So if we send a stress response into these ganglia, we're going to activate a whole bunch of different things. We're going to constrict a lot of these different blood vessels in here. That is what this neuronal divergence is. So each preganglionic neuron, the one that comes into a neuron, can actually connect to 10 to 20 postganglionic neurons. Then each of those is going to branch a whole bunch of times as they go. Which means that one preganglionic neuron can control multiple organs. Sympathetic division is designed for widespread effects. We need to activate a whole bunch of mechanisms very, very quickly. So we don't have time to pass the message on to each individual organ at once. It's like sounding the alarm. Everybody hears it at once, and everybody activates. So these are those adrenal glands that we saw sitting on top of the kidneys. This is going to be attached and controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. So if you are ever very, very scared, you get stressed, you get adrenaline, right? The adrenaline is going to be a response to the sympathetic nervous system kicking on. Something in your body is going to recognize that something is wrong. The fight or flight mechanism will kick on, and as part of that, the adrenal glands will start kicking out more adrenaline. So the adrenal gland has two parts. There's the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. So the cortex is the outside part of the adrenal gland, and it's going to make steroids. The inner part of the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla, is going to be where the primary functions of the adrenal glands are going to happen. This is where the adrenaline, which is also called epinephrine, and the noradrenaline, norepinephrine are going to be made. They're going to be made from the inside, in the center of the adrenal gland. So this is actually a sympathetic ganglia. And so some of those collateral ganglia that we saw, this is one of them. So the presynaptic neuron is actually going to come all the way into the adrenal medulla, and then the postsynaptic neuron will actually come out of that. And so this is going to get stimulated by the preganglionic neuron. Why do you think that is the case? Everything else is controlled by postganglia. Why is this one controlled by preganglia?
Because it's basically like,
Evolutionarily,
It's gotta be fast.
yeah.
fast. You don't even want to take the time to carry out that synapse in the ganglion. You want the initial signal to get there, get the adrenal glands turning on, and then pass the signal on. Because adrenaline is going to have to move through our body to do other things. And the longer you wait to send that adrenaline out, the longer and longer it's going to take for that signal to get elsewhere in our body.
When you inject that and you see when you have a reaction, what is it doing?
So you're talking like an EpiPen.
Yeah, you're not stopping anything, apparently you're adding stuff.
Right. And so adrenaline actually has no role whatsoever in an allergic reaction. It's just that it happens to have the complete opposite effects on your body as the allergic reaction. So an allergic reaction kind of causes your throat to swell. And that's why you would use an EpiPen. You're not using an EpiPen because you're breaking out on your skin. You're using an EpiPen because your throat is closing up, your tongue is swelling up, and blocking your ability to breathe. Luckily, adrenaline does the absolute opposite. And so, like I said, it has no effect on the allergic reaction itself. You're not really going to die from an allergic reaction, you're going to die from not breathing. And so you give yourself the EpiPen injection, it releases your throat so you can breathe, so you can go to the emergency room, and they can take care of the immune response. So that's the sympathetic division. That's the more complicated one. Okay. because it's really going to turn on, turn off, and have a whole bunch of effects. Parasympathetic division is going to be that chill cut, the one that's just going to kind of say, don't worry about it, everything will be fine, keep on doing what you're doing. It's not going to change a whole lot. This is also called the craniosacral division because it's going to come from our brain and the sacral region of the spinal cord. So most of the sympathetic division is coming from the upper part of the spinal cord. So this is going to come from the brain. Part of the sympathetic did also, but our brain is very big and complex, so it can do that. But the upper part of our spinal cord is not complex enough to really control both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. So the upper spinal cord is going to control the sympathetic, and then the very bottom, the sacral region, is going to control the parasympathetic division. So remember, we said that some of the ganglia in the sacral region, they are controlled by ganglia up top. They have to come out of the spinal cord and then turn and go down. That's because the sacral region of the spinal cord is too busy controlling the parasympathetic division. So these preganglionic neurons are going to come from primarily, at least in our brain, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, and then the spinal cord in the sacral region. And this says long preganglionic neurons. So remember, the sympathetic division, we said there was a short preganglionic neuron and then a long postganglionic neuron. So the ganglion was very close, lining up and down our spinal cord, and then we had the long nerve that came out of that and went to the organs. In this, it's the opposite. We have a long preganglionic neuron. And so the ganglion is actually going to be sitting more or less right next to the organ we want to control. And then you have just a short postganglionic neuron that comes out and finishes the connection. So where the sympathetic division had all of that branching that went on, that allowed us to control a bunch of organs at the same time, parasympathetic is the opposite. This is going to be very selective. We can control one organ over another over another. We don't have that neuronal divergence that we saw in the sympathetic division. So this is a diagram similar to what we saw with sympathetic, but you can see that the preganglionic neurons are much longer, and then these ganglia are not going to be lined up along the spinal cord. The cardiac plexus is going to be right next to the heart. The pulmonary plexus is going to be right next to the lung. So some of these are going to be related to our cranial nerves that were in our lecture last week. And so the oculomotor nerve, number 3, 5, 6, 7, 9, and 10 are going to play a role in this parasympathetic division. So some of these things are going to be processes that we can't voluntarily control, and they're going to be part of the parasympathetic division. So we have these coming from the brain, but then again, all the way down to the very bottom of our spinal cord, we're going to have some others come off. And so a few of these are going to come back up at least a little bit and control the lower part of our intestines, but the rest of it is going to be primarily for the reproductive system. So this is a neat little table. This is going to tell you the distinct differences between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. We're not going to go over it, but it just talks about where they start, where the ganglia are located, how long the pre and postganglions are, pre and postganglionic neurons are, how much branching happens in the system, and then what they do. Okay. Questions on presynaptic or sympathetic and parasympathetic. All right. Next thing we've talked about are neurotransmitters in these systems. So last week we talked about neurotransmitters in general as part of our nervous system lecture. We talked about things like acetylcholine and what other neurotransmitters did we talk about? One that started with a G. GABA, right? Acetylcholine and GABA are the two biggest ones for us. So imagine that we have an organ like our heart, where we're going to have both the sympathetic and, actually, let's take a break. This is a good time for a break. Let's start at 5 after the clock, so 8 or 9 minutes.
It is. That is. You get to see Columbia?
Huh?
You get to see Columbia?
No, thank God, because I don't want the other to reel back into sleep and regardless. That's crazy. You always go weekends or every single day? Good kids, right? They're gonna slow up and sit down. You know, if they wanna go with it. Then you have to, what do you do, the newborn right on that chest, right there, shot there? They're too young now, they don't wanna be up for that. You really wanna time you, hook the boat up. Get everything ready, go to the lake, be like 45 minutes. They're just traveling down to draw anywhere. So you just pray that you get them to the right direction. Right? So for the next 15 years of their life. Sorry, honey. I don't look at the kids on the go. You're a lot nicer than I am. I'm just honest with you. I was forced.
Oh, that's right.
I'm open. Wherever we end up, get a place. Out on water. So I can't. Closer to the ocean. Part of the time, buying property in the water, Florida. There's points in places that fluctuate. It's one because sometimes the house fluctuates, so the house goes down. Yeah. I never want to buy that one.
Those are my favorite bars.
Now we'll talk about neurotransmitters. So we have
Yeah.
autonomic neurons from both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions that are going to come into an organ, and they're going to have opposite effects. So the question becomes, how do you have two signals coming into the same organ that are going to have the exact opposite effect? Number one, it's because sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve fibers, they're going to secrete different neurotransmitters. And so one is going to submit norepinephrine, or noradrenaline, and the other is going to use the acetylcholine that we saw previously. The other way that we can accomplish this is that the receptors on the cells that are going to receive those signals are going to be different. And so some cells will have receptors that do one thing when they receive acetylcholine. Another are going to receive something else, that they're going to do the opposite when they receive acetylcholine. You may have cells that only respond to norepinephrine. You may have cells that only respond to acetylcholine. So even though you have both norepinephrine and acetylcholine coming into that cell, there are only receptors on that cell for one of them. And to make it even more complicated and allow a greater range of effects, there are two different acetylcholine receptors and two different norepinephrine receptors. So you can literally get opposite effects in two cells right next to each other from the same neurotransmitter. One may have type A acetylcholine receptor, and the other one might have type B. So acetylcholine is what we talked about last week. This is a very, very common neurotransmitter. And the neurons that are going to secrete acetylcholine are called cholinergic fibers because they secrete acetylcholine. And a receptor that binds acetylcholine is called a cholinergic receptor. And there are two types of cholinergic receptors. There are muscarinic receptors and nicotinic receptors. The muscarinic receptors are in things like cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. And in some cases, we can have either excitatory or inhibitory effects when acetylcholine binds to this receptor, because there are actually subclasses of muscarinic receptors. So you can have two muscarinic receptors right next to each other. Acetylcholine binds to both, and again, you get opposite effects because these two receptors are going to do different things. Nicotinic receptors are in the autonomic nervous receptor postganglionic neuron. So when you have that ganglion, the postganglionic neuron is going to have nicotinic receptors. It's also going to be in the adrenal medulla, the center of the adrenal gland, and then at the neuromuscular junction of skeletal muscle. So muscarinic with cardiac and smooth muscle, nicotinic receptors are in skeletal muscle. And for the nicotinic receptors, these always are excited when acetylcholine binds. They're called muscarinic receptors and nicotinic receptors because people have found other chemicals that will bind to that receptor and have the same effect. And so, if you smoke a cigarette, you get nicotine into your body, nicotine binds to these nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. And so, it's going to activate these postganglionic neurons in your autonomic nervous system. It's going to activate the adrenal medulla. It's going to cause effects in our body similar to if we had a stimulus